Hello, and welcome to Delta Conveyance Deep Dive, a series of online interviews focusing on some of the far-ranging and interconnected topics surrounding the proposed modernization of the state water project infrastructure in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Today, we're going to take a look at the financing mechanisms that make the project possible, both now in the initial planning stages and in the future if the project is approved. While this might not sound like the most exciting aspect of the project, it's definitely one area where there's a great deal of public interest and concern. Understandably, with a project of this scale, most recent estimate of the total cost is around $16 billion. It's not surprising that people want to know who's footing the bill. So here today to help us navigate the backwaters of Delta Conveyance financing is DWR Senior Attorney Chris Martin. Hi, Chris. Welcome to Deep Dive.
Hi, Pat. Thank you.
So to cut right to the chase, how will the Delta Conveyance project be financed?
The Delta Conveyance project would be financed like any other, really any other DWR state water project is financed. And what that means is that typically the department would issue bonds, so debt, and that debt would be repaid over time by the state water contractors who receive water supply from the state water project. Really, the only difference with this project, I suppose, versus the way we would handle any other project is just the magnitude of the costs.
And what role does DWR play in financing the project?
So DWR plays a very central role in financing the state water project. I mean, as the department, we're the owner and operator of the entire state water project. So our responsibility is to raise revenue for the project and keep the lights on, keep it running day to day. And we do that using a combination of, current cash flow, debt issuances, or, essentially financing. And then the state water contractors that receive a water supply from the project reimburse the department for all of those costs. And that's true whether we're talking about construction of a new project, rehabilitation of an existing facility, or even planning for facilities.
Now, strictly speaking, of course, there's no project yet. We're still in the environmental review stage, but that work in and of itself takes a lot of resources, and there's other design and planning that's happening as well. So how is all of that type of work being funded?
So again, the planning work is funded with state water project revenue. That's the simple answer. And what that means is it's money that is ultimately derived from the participating public water agencies that receive their water supply from the state water project. This case is a little bit different, or a little bit more complicated, if you will, again, given the magnitude of the costs. So we're looking at a budget over 4 years, I think, of somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 million just to do the environmental review and planning for this project. And because of that, it's difficult to pay as you go. So one of the options the department is looking at for this project is actually financing those planning costs. But even if the department were to finance the planning costs, at the end of the day, those costs are also borne by the public water agencies that participate in the project.
So recently, DWR initiated a so-called validation action, which received quite a bit of press, some of it claiming that it amounts to the state giving the project a blank check. So Chris, what is a validation action? And is it really a blank check?
Well, no, it's not a blank check, and I'll get to that in a minute. A validation action is actually kind of an unusual thing in the law, because typically courts will only entertain a lawsuit if there's actually a conflict or an argument between parties. Courts don't do what are called advisory judgments typically, which is where they tell you what the law could or would mean, absent some dispute. But validation cases are actually an example of when an agency can go before a court and ask for a judgment absent any actual dispute. And I'll explain the reason why. Any investor in a project, or purchaser of bonds or purchasers of stocks, any investor wants certainty that the issuer of that bond actually has the legal authority to issue the bonds. And for, gosh, at least the last 100 years, the form that certainty takes is what's called a bond counsel opinion. And that's a legal opinion issued by bond counsel that attests to the authority of the issuer, whether that's a government agency or a big corporation. It attests to their authority to issue the debt that they're selling to the public. In this case, we believe that the statutory framework for the department provides us with the authority to issue bonds. What we're doing with the validation action is asking the court if it agrees with our interpretation of the law. And that's the simple answer for what the validation case is intended to accomplish. It's intended to answer the question, does the law give the department the authority to issue debt to construct this project?
So the
validation. Just another question, actually. I'm sorry to cut you off. You asked me if it's a blank check, and the answer to that is no. The amount of debt that would be issued is not an issue before the court. Ultimately, before the department could issue bonds for a project, there has to be a budget for that project. And that budget, whether we're talking about for planning or construction of the project, that budget is reviewed not only by the department, but by the public water agencies that are participating in the planning and may ultimately participate in a project if one is approved. And it's important to remember that each of those public water agencies has its own public board that meets in public and reviews these things and is there to look out for the interests of their local service area. So there are a lot of steps involved in determining what the cost of a project is.
Okay, so the validation is simply to confirm the validity of an agency's bonds before they're issued. So do we know when that will be?
The simple answer is no, and there are a number of reasons for that. It also depends on which bonds we're talking about. And so I'll get into the weeds here for just a minute. When we're talking about a conveyance project and the validation action for that matter, we're actually talking about two different categories of bonds. Their first category of bonds are bonds that would be intended to pay for or finance the cost of environmental review. So that means debt that would be issued to finance the very large expenditures necessary to do CEQA review under the California Environmental Quality Act, to meet with agencies that are responsible for looking out for endangered species or water quality. All of those things take a tremendous amount of money. And one category of bonds would be directed at paying those costs. Now, before we can issue those bonds, at a minimum, we have to have completed this validation case so that we can give our investors certainty. And there are other prerequisites that are required too. Of course, we have to have contractual obligations or arrangements, I should say, in place for the repayment of those bonds. The other category of bonds would be bonds issued to construct a facility. And there, in addition to the validation case being a prerequisite to the issuance of those bonds, obviously the biggest thing that would have to happen is the department would actually have to approve a project. We haven't done that. We're in the early stages of planning, looking at a number of alternatives. If and when the department approves a project, we would be closer to issuing bonds, but even project approval isn't necessarily enough. So one way to say that is it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are other prerequisites that would have to be satisfied. Among those is a legal requirement that the department have in place arrangements to provide not just for the repayment of bonds to construct the facility, but the payment of operation and maintenance costs for the duration of the project's lifetime. So there are a number of steps in place that need to be completed before bonds would be issued. And I haven't gone into a whole category of activities that's actually involved in any transaction for the sale of bonds, which is a whole lot of negotiation of contracts and preparation of disclosure documents and other things that are involved in a sale. And of course, none of those things has happened yet either.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the bond process, because
Sure.
it can be a little bit confusing for those of us who aren't financial lawyers. So first, who buys the bonds?
I could say I don't know because I often don't know the actual names involved. But what typically happens is that the bonds are purchased by investment banks or large institutional investors. Now, they might be banks, they might be insurance companies, but they're very large organizations. And the department issues today, when we don't have a Delta Conveyance facility, just to operate and maintain the existing state water project, hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds every year. So they get purchased by investment banks or other institutional investors. And in the case of investment banks, they may resell those bonds to retail investors like you and I. Now, over time, those bonds will get bought and sold in the financial markets. And so it's hard to say actually who owns them. You know, I don't know who owns them at any one time. But there are investors who are members of the public who hold those bonds.
So I guess that kind of relates to my second question here. Who does hold the bonds, and what does that really mean?
So a simple way to look at it is the bond represents a loan, if you will. So when somebody buys a bond, one way to look at it is the cost of that bond is essentially money that they're lending to the department. And in return, the department agrees to pay principal and interest on that bond and eventually pay off the entire principal balance of that bond. So, you know, in terms of who holds them, it could be any member of the public who invests in municipal securities. As I said, typically they do tend to be, at least initially, large organizations, institutional investors, if you will. But there are lots of individual people who own department debt.
So how will the participating agencies participating in the project repay DWR for the bonds?
So the way the bonds are repaid would occur in the same manner that it does today. So whenever the department issues, there are several pieces, I should say. When the department issues debt, it technically promises to use state water project revenue to repay that debt. That's the promise we make to the holders of the bonds. Our water supply contracts describe where that revenue comes from. And the source of that revenue is actually our state water project contractors. So that's all the public agencies that receive a water supply. Their revenue, in turn, comes from a couple of different sources, usually, and its specific source depends on the agency. They're all different. But two typical sources that are used are either revenue from the water rates and charges that those agencies bill their customers, or in some cases, some of the costs are paid with revenue raised from local property taxes. So there are contractors who rely wholly on one source or the other, or in some cases, a combination of both. And we've got 29 different contractors, and I'd venture to guess we've probably got 29 different combinations of revenue that contribute to those agencies' revenue streams.
So will the cost of the project then affect the rates and or taxes for customers of the participating public water agencies?
It might. Because each agency is different and each agency, they each have a portfolio, if you will, of water supply. So an agency may get some of its water supply from the State Water Project. They may also have local supplies that are developed, whether that's groundwater or some other source. And they may import supplies from other places. And so their rates are made up of the cost of all those different sources. So it's really hard to say, to provide a dollar amount and say that everybody's water rates will go up by this percentage or that number of dollars. What I can say is that each agency will consider the cost of the project and the impact on rates before agreeing to move forward with a project like that. And they have local boards who are considering those questions. But whether they go up and by how much is really a question that only the local agencies themselves can answer.
So Chris, what we've just been talking about here with the local agencies, is that what's meant by the phrase beneficiary pays?
More or less, yeah. The State Water Project it's unusual for a state entity, if you will. We aren't on the state budget at the State Water Project. The State Water Project is operated more like a utility, and the entirety of the costs of water supply from that project are either paid or reimbursed by the public water agencies that benefit from the project, hence the phrase beneficiary pays. So that means that, whether we're talking about day-to-day operational costs, capital investments for new or existing facilities, ultimately those costs are borne by the public water agencies that receive that water supply from the State Water Project.
So in closing, if you had to point to one especially stubborn misconception or a misunderstanding that you run into when talking to people about funding for the Delta Conveyance Project, what would that be?
Well, there's several, but I think the most persistent or most widely disseminated misconception would be the notion that the State Water Project is funded out of the state's general fund or from state tax revenue. That's not the case today. Now, it is true that back in the late 50s and the early 60s, the state contributed seed money, if you will, to get the project going. But even in that case, ultimately those funds were repaid by the participants in the State Water Project who received water supply from it. So we aren't on the state budget. The project is operated independently and is essentially self-funded with respect to its water supply purposes. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception that you'll hear on a regular basis, is that we're somehow state funded. And for several decades, that has not been the case.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks for this very informative deep dive session.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to answer the questions.
And we hope that you'll join us for our next deep dive. Visit the Delta Conveyance playlist on YouTube to see more episodes of the Delta Conveyance Deep Dive video series. And we have a long list of future topics, so please stay tuned. Thank you.